Namaskar to everybody. Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. I am deeply honored that I have this opportunity to speak at the function of the Rashtram School, which is a great upcoming center now. And I am so glad that I have this opportunity to address a subject which is of great importance in this very stressful hour, because our nation is facing all kinds of grave challenges today. So we must remember what our great men in the past have said about Indian nationalism and about India as a nation, because it is that which is going to steer us out of the storm that has engulfed us these days. So I begin a small talk of 20-25 minutes and tell you something about what Shri Aurobindo had to say. Of course, he has written volumes and volumes on it, as you all know. So I have chosen to speak upon what seems to me to be his very first statement, as you all know. That was the Uttar speech. And to my mind, that speech is one of the earliest statements. And that statement is something that holds right till the end of his writing, because it is on the spirit of that statement that he expounded. We have also to see what was the national situation at that time, and why he had to make, or rather why he had this great realization about the spiritual role of Sanata Dharma, and why he made this very unequivocal statement. Today we are all confused and besotted with ideas which, whenever we talk of Sanatan Dharma, ideas which encircle us in the name of plurality, in the name of secularism, in the name of modernity or ethnic diversity. But the real crux of what Shri Aurobindo said had taken into account all those things even at that time. And as a matter of fact, the very debates in which we are engaged today had very well begun around 1880s, especially when 1885 people like Sir Syed Ahmad had said very explicitly that as and when the British leave, then Hindus and Muslims will not be able to live together, and that they are something like two different nations. So it was as early as that something like a two-nation theory had come into being. It was not with Jinnah, please. It was with Sir Syed Ahmad. Historically, it is known. And it is at this point that great men like Shri Aurobindo took up the challenge. And in fact, it is Shri Aurobindo who stated the whole thing in very clear terms. Great men like Vivekananda, by whom of course Aurobindo was inspired, had looked upon the things more in spiritual and cultural terms. But Shri Aurobindo gave us an idea of Sanatan Dharma which covered nationalism in very explicit terms. Now, Shri Aurobindo, as you know, when he came out of the Alipur jail after serving there for 1 year, gave this speech. And he said that when he went to jail, at that time the whole country was resounding with the sounds of Vande Mataram. And now he felt, that is when he was out of the Alipur jail, that there was some kind of a brief lull. And it seems that there was some kind of a disappointment at that time, and people thought that the upsurge of nationalism had abated. So Sri Aurobindo comes and gives this message. And the first thing he says is that he is addressing a religious society, he is addressing a religious issue, but then he says that he is not going to talk about theology. He is going to talk about the most important thing in the context of religion at that time, and that was Indian nationalism. So he says that very clearly, that it was Hindu nationalism that he is going to talk about, and he equates it very, very clearly with Sanatan Dharma. Now, this should make it very clear in our minds that he was not going to address some deep issue about the nature of what is called Hindu religious beliefs, but because he knew that all those religious beliefs or theology or culture by which India proclaims its identity is rooted in the sense of Dharma. So you can find here the first statement on Dharma in the context of nationalism, and it is a statement which is very clear and unequivocal. Today, after something like 70 years of Nehruvian socialism in the practice and air and political conflict and whatnot, and various other theories of nationalism, we find ourselves very hesitant in trying to accept the fact that for India, Dharma is an essential, or rather a fundamental concept which covers each and everything in our lives, and therefore it has to cover our political life, our national life, our cultural life, our independence as a nation, and our progress into future. Future is very important because, as Sri Aurobindo said, that we don't have to only see the sunrises of the past, but also the afternoons of the future. So the whole concept of Sanata, something which is not limited to a single period, was stated by him. This is the first thing that he said. But what he said and explained to people was his experience. You see, I find that particular speech, which is not very long, and in terms of text it's about five pages or so, very crucial, because Sri Aurobindo gives an account of one of the fundamental experiences of his life. And this was that when he went to jail, he was a political worker. He was a great nationalist on whom the thought that sat heaviest on his mind was the freedom of India. And he felt that the freedom struggle had not begun at that time, and that the goal of India's independence was far, far away. So that brought his spirit down, and he didn't know how to come out of those very sad and depressed thoughts. And this was the paramount feeling with which he went into the jail and stayed for some months. And it is there that the transformation took place. He says that he had the great experience about which he had read earlier. He had read in the Bhagavad Gita, he had read in the Upanishads, he had read in several things, although by that time, as he himself admits, he was not a great scholar of classical Hindu texts. but he had an idea, some sort of an idea. But before all that, he had this crucial experience in jail. What was this experience? The experience was, all is Vasudeva. So the Mahavakya Sarvamidam Khalu Brahma, which has been stated in the Upanishads and which we take to be the cornerstone of Indian philosophy, was something that he experienced. Now this is very important. We must understand that he experienced this all. It was not something about which he thought and made an opinion or wrote a book about or formulated an opinion which he could circulate, or a dogma or a political system or a thought. No, it was a direct experience. For those of us who have some inkling of what is Indian philosophy, people like us who are dependent upon the great words of sages like Sri Aurobindo and others in our tradition, for those of us who depend upon what has been told to us, we have heard that it is not a statement, it is not even a Mahavakya as stated in words, but it is a Swanabhuti, experience by yourself, which makes us realize the truth. As Bhartrihari has said, that Shiva is Swanabhutyam Ekamanam. He is the only criteria of self-experience. So this self-experience of Vasudeva, that all is Vasudeva, the friend and foe, brown and white, Englishman and Indian, whosoever was there in the jail was one. And it is after this great experience, he also had two, he says so, he had two messages from the divine. Now, this is important to understand as to why Sri Aurobindo said that Indian nationalism is Sanatan Dharma, or that India is Sanatan Dharma and Sanatan Dharma is India. Because he experienced it. He himself came to understand this. And he says in this very speech that all doubts were cleared. That he had been some sort of a doubting person, semi-atheist, questioning man. But after this profound experience, all doubts were cleared. And he was able to understand and see and perceive and feel and rise to that level of consciousness in which India is Sanatan Dharma and Sanatan Dharma is India. So what he said to his audience in the Uttar speech is something he experienced firsthand. The important thing which he came to realize was that he should give up the anxiety of winning the freedom for India, and that he was assured that Vasudeva tells him that he has started the work and Aurobindo is only a small speck in that great movement. And out of these two messages, Vasudeva tells him to do the work of Vasudeva, number one, and number two, that India is Sanatan Dharma. So it is a divine message, so to speak, that Sri Aurobindo has. This is the realization in terms of Swanubhuti, and it is in terms of this great understanding. Now you can see that this is a definition of India. This is an idea of India. You know, this phrase idea of India is very common, and many people have written books about this phrase, or taking a kind of resting place on this phrase idea of India. I would say that to describe the experience of Sri Aurobindo, it is better to say that it is neither a perception of India for Sri Aurobindo, nor a view of India, nor just an experience of India, but the deepest realization of the truth of India. So the truth of India, what really India is known to him through that experience in the Alipur jail in that 1 year period, and that changes his whole perception as a political worker. Because at this point he was still somebody who was striving for the freedom of the country and working as an individual, as a political person as well, apart from all other things. It is later on that he decides to go in for yoga only and to work at a higher level. But at the terrestrial level, this was the work still being done, and this was the message given to him. Now, what is the significance of this message? The significance of the message is that here you have a deep vision of India as Sanatan Dharma. And this was the idea which was taken up later on by Veer Savarkar. As a matter of fact, when you read the 1923 work Hindutva by Savarkar, he at that time when he published his book, he gave his name as Maratha. Then you find that it is essentially the same vision. Of course, there are some seeming differences. Now please mark my words. I am saying seeming differences because Sri Aurobindo states in the Uttar speech that Sanatan Dharma and rise of Sanatan Dharma and rise of Sanatan Dharma in India is the rise of India, but it is not just for this territory or this piece of land, so to speak, called India, but it is for the whole world. And he makes it in many words very clear that Sanatan Dharma is neither a mere theological category, because it has the capacity to include the well-being of the whole cosmos or all Srishti. So you can see that definition of Sanatan Dharma as given by Sri Aurobindo is not nationalistic in terms of the nation state only. It is not in terms of a region of the world. It is not just in terms of the cultural or ethnographic or historical experience of a nation called India. But through the agency of all these, it is for the whole of the world. And he says that if there is rise of India, then that is going to benefit the whole world. So what we today in various other words like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, etc. are stating it again and again, Sri Aurobindo had made it very clear that this vision of Sanatan Dharma is the vision of the eternal. And what is eternal is not something which can be closely demarcated within a territory, but it is something which has to be for the whole of humanity. So this is the definition of Sanatan Dharma. Now, by the time we come to say 1920, many other political changes happen. As I mentioned right in the beginning of my talk, that the two-nation theory had been stated. And it is as a counter to that limited vision of two-nation, Hindu versus Muslim, that Sri Aurobindo had given this great, profound experience about the truth and reality of India. That is why he calls it Sanatan Dharma. Later on, by the time we come to Savarkar, Savarkar gives it a nationalistic definition in terms of a territory. Now, this had become very important because in 1920, something very significant happened. It was not only significant, it was almost tragic. And that was a repetition of the two-nation theory in a different form, which was unfortunately at this time endorsed by none other than Mahatma Gandhi. That is, in 1920, Mahatma Gandhi had talked about the Khilafat, and he had encouraged the Indian Muslims to pledge faithfulness and service to the Khalifa of the Ottoman Empire and to go and fight for him. And I think it was around 30 or 40,000 Indian Muslim youth who had gone there to fight for him. So when this idea that people can go from outside the Indian subcontinent and go and serve a leader of the Ummah or leader of the Caliphate or the Caliph, Khalifa as he was called, and when a leader like Mahatma Gandhi was endorsing it, supporting it, then certain boundaries had to be made, and Savarkar came up with the idea that Indian nationalism is to be defined in terms of Hindu and Hindutva. And then of course you all know that he gave the definition of Hindu, Sindhu Sindhu Pariyanta Yasya Bharat Bhumika Pitra Bhumischa Punya Bhumischa Sahindu Riti Smrata. The idea that this is the territory and one who considers this as his fatherland, motherland, and as his holy land is Hindu, and this is Hindu nationalism. But remember that Savarkar is only taking a piece out of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo has given the deepest, the widest, and the fullest meaning of the whole thing. And it is this fullness which we have to realize. I suppose that once we realize as Indians, as Bharatiyas, as people born here, as people having the faith in Sanatan Dharma, you see, not just the faith as Hindu, but the faith as a Sanatani. Sanatani, not as some Arya Samajis would like to call it in terms of person who worships Murti, not in that limited sense, but in the most wide sense, in the profoundest and the deepest sense, which Sri Aurobindo used the word Sanatan Dharma. So Sanatan Dharma then begins in terms of text, it begins with the Rig Veda or the earliest text of this country, right up to the times of the modern times and the vision of the great rishis. In terms of lived experience and culture, it is all the languages, it is all the experiences that the people of this land have, and it is also, as he said, Sri Aurobindo said, the totality of existence. So his definition, Aurobindo's definition of Sanatan Dharma, is not just humanitarian. You see, it is not integral humanism, or it is not ekatmatavad, manav ekatmatavad or something like that. It is much bigger. It is something which goes to the core of existence, because India has that vision. He tries to make that point, and he tries to make us aware of that point. And once we are aware of it, then without any sense of hesitation, we should be able to accept that the definition of Sanatana as given by Aurobindo, as given by many other saints. You see, there are hundreds of verses which have this fourth pad or the fourth charan, Dharmo Esha Sanatana. You see, there are hundreds of verses in Indian tradition, Satyam Bruyat, Priyam Bruyat, Na Bruyat, Satyam Apriyam, etc., and ending with Dharmo Esha Sanatana. So there are so many verses in our tradition that talk about it in terms of practical enunciations. The depth and the expanse of this thing as given to us by Shri Aurobindo. Thank you very much for giving me a patient ear.
Yes, sir. For your wonderful